Okay, we're talking to Cliff Sims, the White House videographer, on his new book, Team of Vipers. He actually wasn't the videographer, but that's what Trump likes to call him.
Got a great Kellyanne Conway story. Kellyanne, we would always tell the stories about how Kellyanne would, come on the show during the campaign and, say, oh, I can't wait for this to be over. It's a joke. And, Mike, the last day, what did she say? This is...
When I asked Kellyanne the morning of the election, I said, you're probably going to be relieved when this is all over. And she looked right at me. She said, oh, Mike, she said, this has just been like spending a semester abroad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so anyway, but you tell a very funny story about how we talk about how she's like the leaker extraordinaire.
Yeah.
And she's... Well, you tell the story.
Yeah, so you guys said that she was, off air, she would basically say, I need to go take a shower because she felt dirty being, working for Donald Trump.
Right. Oh, and she did after talking about him.
So she calls me up to her office upstairs in the West Wing and says, hey, I want to do a response to this. And, as a messaging guy, she's like, I want your help in crafting this statement. So I'm like, okay. So I sit down on her Apple laptop and I start typing. And she's sitting at her desk on her iPhone. And she's texting away and forgets that the iMessages are synced between her iPhone and her laptop.
I hate when that
Which, by the way, has anything good ever come of that? No accidental good ever happens from that. And so I'm watching as I'm supposed to be crafting a statement defending her against exactly what she's doing in this moment, which is telling reporters, trashing her colleagues to reporters, talking about how the president she has to babysit the guy and, whatever.
She was saying, writing that in that moment?
In that moment, as I'm supposed to be
cleaning up her mess.
That statement. Yes.
She's creating more.
Yes. And of course, she denies that. She says, not true. If I was a leaker, I would get much better press. And I think there's actually a pretty good solution to this issue. All she has to do is tell every reporter in Washington, D.C., she can publicly say, if I have ever trashed the president off the record to you, I release you from the off-the-record binds. You can put that on the record. That's all she'd have to do to solve that problem.
It would be a very, very long line of reporters stepping up to microphones, telling their stories. Heidi, you have a question for Cliff.
Actually, segueing from that, the logical question, Cliff, would be the relationship with her husband now on Twitter, where he is really one of the president's biggest critics. Based on what you saw, do you think that's all just an act, that Kellyanne is actually just looking towards this as some kind of a cover, like some other people in the White House as well, for when this is all over?
Yeah, I don't know. That's certainly the kind of favorite parlor game, the rumor around Washington, D.C., that it is, all a big act. But let's just be honest, would this ever work in corporate America? If you had an executive at a Fortune 100 company whose spouse spent every waking moment trashing the CEO of that company, would that ever fly? And the answer is obviously no. So is it a charade? Is the whole thing a game? Are they trying to play both sides? I really don't know.
Gene Robinson.
My question is about Jared Kushner, and it's just a big question mark. I mean, does he was the grand negotiator who failed to get a deal on the wall with Congress. He's, as far as I can tell, as of this hour this morning, he hasn't solved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's supposed to do all these things. He never seems to get them done, with the one exception of prison reform. Tell me about his role in the White House and your interactions with him.
Well, my interactions with Jared were pretty much all positive, I have to say. I think he's a sharp guy. Certainly, I don't think you can undersell the prison reform thing, how important that was, a heavy lift. But I do think that there are times when you would like to see others who maybe a little deeper experience in certain policy areas be able to take the lead, and maybe the interactions with Congress there, Mike Pence playing a role in that. But I think ultimately, the president trusts Jared implicitly, and that's important for a president. If you think about the way he ran his business, it was really kind of a family business, and that's kind of what he's brought into the presidency. And really what you're seeing is kind of an erosion of the historical presidency, kind of the apparatus around him, and it's really more and more becoming a family business inside the White House at this point.
Cliff, do you have any children?
I don't, but actually my wife and I are in the process of adopting from Colombia right now.
For you.
Nice. Excellent.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, is there anything about the Trump presidency, about Donald Trump being president of the United States, that scares you?
People ask me this question a lot, and I have to be honest. There isn't, because I think that is asked in the context of, oh my gosh, is this guy, he's got control of the nuclear weapons, and I just never saw anything on the inside that made me scared in that way. Certainly there's things I disagree with, certainly things that I wish were done different, but I think he takes those decisions, those life and death decisions, very seriously. There's a scene in the book where right after the first Navy SEAL was killed, the first one under his watch, and an interaction between he and I, a very poignant moment where I could feel the weight of the presidency and those life and death decisions, and I do think he takes those things very seriously.
Cliff, we've wondered for a couple of years now around this table how some people in the White House swallow some of the things that they're asked to do, and you write in the book about one of the very first days of the Trump presidency, where Sean Spicer is sent out into that briefing room to say it was the largest crowd in the history of inauguration crowds, and you had to draft those remarks. And you write in the book that you knew well it was not a bigger crowd than Obama's or the biggest of all time or whatever you had to put in those remarks. How do you grapple with that now as you look back, knowing something is not true, but having to go out and sell it?
Well, one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book is, if I'm going to be critical of anyone else, I better be willing to be critical of myself. And so I do that a lot. I talk about how I was ruthless at times and caught up in kind of the game and the machinations of the whole, proximity to power and everything that does to people. But that first day, I mean, I say it's one of the biggest regrets I have in the White House, because the first piece of work that I put my hands to was a debacle. At the time, we're sitting there trying to, we've got a directive, as you said. What we're trying to make a case is this is the largest inaugural crowd ever. So we have Tom Barrack, who's the head of the inaugural committee there, has given us all kinds of stats and all kinds of different stuff, and I'm kind of compiling things and writing it down. And ultimately, the argument that I landed on was, okay, the proliferation of the internet globally at this point, we know that there was more people watching online than there were in 2008. So let's say the largest crowd online and in person. And Sean, I think, leaned in a little bit further to the in-person side than we initially
how did you feel about, I'm just on a human level, how did you feel about having to do that?
Well, like I said, I don't feel like I was lying at the time. Like I said, we're trying to put the best shine we can on it. That's why we bring in the internet numbers and things like that. I never felt like I did something. I never felt like I was asked directly to lie. I never felt like I lied. But I also didn't have to be an on-camera spokesperson for the president, which is clearly a very, very difficult job.
So you think Sean Spicer, Sarah Sanders, for example, have been asked to lie and have in fact lied on TV?
I think what is more often the case is, especially with Sarah, who I think is a good person and a very tough job, goes out sometimes without all of the facts, and you find out after the fact that what she said was not exactly correct.
I mean, but you can see the crowd, so these guys went out and lied.
Yeah, we're not blind.
Right. Okay. Just clarifying.
It's interesting. When we went to the White House,
he was obsessed with it. I mean, I would think you'd be in shock.
He was.
This is your first job.
Absolutely obsessed with it. He had pictures all over of all the crowd sizes and saying, "Look how big it is from here, and look how big it is from there." Wow. And I do remember that day. I had seen that there was that they had gone out and they were putting up pictures in the White House briefing room of the crowd sizes.
God.
And I remember calling, who did I talk to? Reince. I called Reince. I said, Reince, I just want you to know, if you guys hold your first press conference on the crowd size, we are going to absolutely destroy you on Monday morning. We're going to kill you for it, and everybody else is.
Well, what's interesting is in that scene, Reince Priebus actually comes into Sean's office and says, why are we rushing? Like, what are we doing here? And Sean was all kind of manic and all whipped up in the whole thing and just trying to get out there, and I think wanting to prove to Trump that he was willing to go in there and, punch back. And even Sean has said, in his own book, that he regretted the way that played out. But I thought it was interesting that Reince was trying to pump the brakes on that.
And what Reince said also, though, was that Trump was just absolutely out of his mind about this, screaming and yelling and telling him to get out there.
What a great start.
Be tougher. Yeah, good start.
Cliff Sims, thank you. The book is Team of Vipers, My 500 Extraordinary Days in the Trump White House. It's out today.
By the way, roll Tide.
Roll Tide, baby.
We'll get them next year.
I think so.
All right,
Thanks,
still
Cliff.
ahead.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.